Ladies, gentlemen, and haradrim of all ages, it's happened! We had our second and final stream talking with the developers about the changes to the game that will be happening before Season 2, and, well, it's pretty damn major. They talked for about 90 minutes, so I'm going to condense all the important things they said down as short and concisely as I can for you all, and I'll talk a bit about my current thoughts too, but as of the end of this stream, we also had the full patch notes for Season 2 drop, so I will be diving into those properly tomorrow, and then we'll have a much fuller picture of what is to come. That said, the stream itself was more of an overview of the more significant changes and an explanation of the ideals of the dev team that led to those changes, which should be able to help us predict how they will treat the game and update it in the future too. Not to mention they told us about a couple of pretty major features coming in patch 1.2.1, which will be the first major patch after the season comes out. Going in order, the major sections here are elemental resistances and updates to them as a concept, updates to the vast majority of uniques in the game as well, specifically to make them more exciting to have drop and to actually use, updates to damage buckets to sort of refocus how we look at stats, and the way that they've done this is a really big change that will divide the community a bit, so look forward to that section. And of course there is also the 1.2.1 talk that I mentioned too. Starting off with resistances then, up until this point, resistances have been inverse multiplicative, meaning the amount that you gain from resistances on your gear goes down the more resistance that you already have, and it sort of made a weird scaling to the system that sort of broke the whole thing. In Season 2 and onwards, resistances will be additive, so 20% on a piece of equipment is actually always going to be plus 20%, but it caps at 70% reduction for each element, aside from a few specific ways that will let you increase the cap up to 85% in the new system. An example that they show being resistance elixirs, which now increase your resistance cap for that element by 6%, which is a really big increase, honestly, once you're up at that point. So it's entirely possible that we might actually start using resistance elixirs in certain situations. As well, armor values will now only be for physical damage, trying to get you to think more about your resistances here. However, to even it out, rings will now, like amulets, give you bonuses to all resistances as a baseline, as well as having a bonus singular resistance increase too. Their goals for this is for most people to reach the base cap around level 80 for most of their resistances, but also to make it not the most necessary thing to focus on in your build because of the baseline from the jewelry. Then we had some talk about the uniques, changes being made to them, the concepts of why, and of course this is only a few of the actual uniques that are going to be shown here, though we'll dive into the full list tomorrow with the proper patch note video. The first thing that they say immediately is their goal is to make uniques feel genuinely exciting across the board, and so they implemented a four-fold strategy. New stats on uniques that don't exist on other types of gear, larger versions of existing stat ranges that you would find on other pieces of gear, overriding slot rules, like putting cooldown reduction on a weapon as an example, or just changes to the unique effect itself to actually make them more desirable and less weirdly ineffective. For example, Ancient Oath for Barbarians used to slow enemies when they were hit by Steel Grasp, but that didn't really do a whole lot, so instead they've changed it to a short-term damage increase against enemies that are hit by this move to make it stronger in a way that players will actually seem to care about. Examples given were Fists of Fate now having a new stat, Lucky Hit Chance to increase damage for a short time, which is pretty solid, Grasp of Shadow, much higher shadow clone damage increase, Hellhammer, massive increase to the stat ranges as well as giving it skill ranks, which is great on the weapon. Ancient's Oath we already talked about, and then developers talked briefly about how they will also be adding in a number of new legendaries and uniques, specifically 18 of them coming in with Season 2, and gave us 3 proper examples. Flicker Step, this one seems nuts and they didn't specify a class, so I think it may well be for everyone, and this reduces your ultimate skill cooldown by 2 to 4 seconds depending on the role when you dash through enemies, and there are definitely some builds that will absolutely destroy with this concept for sure. There's another new unique, this time specifically for Rogue, Scoundrel's Leather, which would be when Inner Sight is active. When it actually activates properly, it gives your core skills a 64% chance to spawn random traps, including Death Trap, which is a very cool concept. And the last one they showed is the Dolmen Stone Amulet for Druids, which I absolutely fucking love. It makes boulders that you cast during Hurricane actually get caught in the rotation of the Hurricane and just rotate around you like a wrecking ball, which honestly completely makes boulder builds way cooler, potentially stronger too. I've always loved the concept of boulder builds with some of the legendaries that they have in the game, but it never quite worked, and I'm hoping this might actually be the thing that changes that, so I'm a big fan of this. Past this, they simply showed the full target farming list for uniques in relation to the new endgame bosses, and I will display them here, of course, so you can see where any in particular that you want to farm come Season 2 will be, which bosses you want to aim for to make it easier. These aren't guaranteed drops by any means, but they have higher drop rates from these bosses than they do from anywhere else in the game. Again, these bosses being Gregoire, Varshan, Lord Zir, the Beast in Ice, and the new big boss, Duriel. Moving on from that, then we had some talks and examples about class improvements being made here, and they start off strong here as Fortify is being changed to work off of maximum health instead of base health, which will absolutely be a major buff to that side of the game just as a whole. Then they did want to specify that the majority of changes are buffs, but they did also have to rein in a bit of the overperforming or bugged interactions in order to rebalance the game as a whole, which is a pretty lofty goal, honestly, that they set for themselves here. One of the major changes that they've made is going through and just putting a cap on anything that theoretically had infinite power scaling possible before. For example, Supreme Wrath of the Berserker for Barbarian, or Rampaging Werebeast for Druid and its insane crit multiplying ability. These things now have caps on them so that they can boost other parts of classes and builds without worrying about creating ludicrously broken infinite scalars like that. An example they gave was, what if they want to put in a power that lets Druid just be in Grizzly Rage permanently? Well, if they still had the infinite scalar there, they can never do that, and that would remove that entire concept from the game, which would honestly have been really fun, so this is why they're doing it. They also made some changes to pre-existing paragon nodes as well, trying to find some of the weaker or lesser used ones and buffing them into actually mattering for certain builds, with the Decimator node for Barbarian being used as an example here, and they also mentioned that they made the Berserking bonus damage for Barbs a multiplier instead of additive, so that will become a much bigger deal starting in Season 2 as well, and the Ancestral Force legendary now works in a much more reasonable way too, affecting the normal shockwave of Hammer of the Ancients rather than creating a second explosion. On top of this, I should mention on the note of Paragon glyphs, they seem to have added an extra 2 Paragon glyphs for every single class in the game, so 10 total, 2 per class, and these will have differing effects depending on the class, but they're trying to expand around what types of builds you can actually build with using your Paragon node specifically. Then we move on to some Sorcerer changes. They lowered the ramp up time for Incinerate. It still does the same total damage, but should just be more comfortable and fun to play around now. Enhanced Frozen Orb now has more single target applications as well, and they adjusted both the Winter and Electrocute Paragon glyphs so that you can, actually activate their effects finally if you want to on your Paragon board. For Rogue, they said they were relatively happy with how it was at the moment, aside from everyone just using Puncture as a basic skill with very little exception. So they applied a bunch of buffs and changes to the other 4 basic skill options, which should in theory incentivize their use, especially when considering the damage bucket changes that we will talk about in a moment, as the main reason that Puncture was used in excess before was because of the vulnerable application. As well, a nice buff to the Impetus passive that will make it much more usable. For Druids, they once again gave a massive buff to Ravens across the board. Will this one be enough? We'll have to see. Then they applied another notable damage bonus to Rabies. Again, I guess their previous buffs to these skills didn't do quite as much as they wanted, so they just sort of did it again. And then moving on to Necro, this first one actually does also affect Druid, and it's the Death Defense passive that Necro had before, is now just a baseline part of how minions and companions of all kinds within the game function now. So now, no summon with a health bar can be hit for more than 30% of its health in a single attack, which is a pretty solid change. As well, they gave Golems a pretty big damage increased the damage values on various minion Paragon nodes as well, adjusted the Coldbringer aspect so it makes all skeletal mages cast Blizzard instead of only cold mages, and they consolidated the various Thorns minions legendary aspects into only one aspect that makes Thorns apply to all Necro minions at once. As well, shields now have armor on them because, well, they're shields and they probably should have armor. Past that, we get into the real meat of all of this. Damage buckets are getting heavily reworked, and it is going to shift the entire way that we think about how to make builds within this game. A lot of people are going to be upset at that statement as a concept, but having thought of a lot of different ways that they could have gone about changing damage buckets to try and fix it, I think this is an extremely strong choice that they've gone with. Yes, significant changes can make it feel like we are beta testing the game again. I know a lot of people feel this way, but we can all agree that the game in its current state before this patch is fundamentally broken, which means that they have to change fundamental parts of the game in order to fix it. This is a major starting point to me. Previous to Season 2, Vulnerable and Crit was just the required way to play at a high level within this game. Nothing else could create the same damage numbers than overlapping those effects due to the specific way they multiplied each other. In Season 2, stat bonuses you get from gear and such that add damage to these multipliers will not actually multiply. It will just count as additive damage. If an affix now says plus 30% crit damage, what it means is plus 30% damage when you get a critical hit, not that it adds to the crit multiplier, with the only multipliers being the base 50% for a critical hit, the base 20% from an enemy being vulnerable, and then they're also making some changes to overpower, which will make it on a similar level in the future too, which is pretty cool. As a whole, all of this means that our numbers in-game will be lower, and again, people will be upset about the concept of lower numbers, and I get it, but this is a major change, and according to the devs as well, they've gone through and rebalanced the entirety of the game, every monster around the new expected output of players, and the idea is that high-end builds in Season 2 should feel equal to or stronger than high-end builds did in Season 1, but also to remove the massive punishment that existed for not going full in on crit and vulnerable beforehand, in an effort to make more builds, things that would have been considered lesser before actually be a lot closer to high end now. Personally, I think these damage bucket changes are actually really healthy for the game. Less infinite stacking things means a more controlled environment, which means that they can create more purposeful fun through other interactions or new builds that just wouldn't have functioned around without those previous parameters. The intention is to make the fun come less from just being good at applying math to a video game and more about just finding cool things that synergize well together. Then the last planned section that they had was just a couple of tidbits about the first major patch coming after the start of Season 2, which is patch 1.2.1. They only told us 2 things here, but both of them are pretty neat. First up, there will be a training dummy added to the game so you can actually practice with builds or just check out differences between pieces of gear in an actual properly controlled environment. As someone who makes a lot of builds, wants to test a bunch of synergies between abilities, between powers, seasonal effects, I absolutely love this. But hey, who doesn't enjoy having a training dummy to just beat up sometimes, right? Then the second thing is that they will be adding a refund all paragon nodes button to the game within patch 1.2.1. Definitely a very long requested feature. I would have loved to have it sooner, but I'll take it when it comes rather than just never getting it, of course. Then we just have some slight revelations from the question and answer section that are a bit less organized. One big thing that they mentioned was that they want to fix things like Barbarian builds requiring all 3 shouts to perform properly, or Sorcerers using 4 defensive skills at once, but they aren't quite sure how to do that right yet, so they are heavily looking into how to, but that won't be fixed as of Season 2, sadly. Then they specifically mentioned that there are actually no new Uber uniques being added within Season 2. All of the new uniques that will be added are in the regular rarity pool, which is nice to see for sure. Then finally, they mentioned that along with most monsters being rebalanced for the new player power threshold, they are also heavily nerfing Uber Lilith as a boss. They want her to be an achievable goal for an average build at level 100, not something that only ridiculously perfectly made builds or bugged builds can achieve, so that will become much easier in the new season for sure. And that just about does it for the stream then. Of course, again, we will cover the full patch notes in more detail tomorrow for those who want to see it, but for the people that just wanted the overview of the stream itself, that's it. What do you think? Personally, I think that while they have made some pretty damn major changes here that will likely need adjusting in the future to really perfect it properly, they've all been good decisions that they're making here. As much as I hate to say it, for the long-term health of the game, this is really good. I hate that we are in the position that these kinds of changes are necessary, but I do think that from we currently are, these are a lot of the correct decisions to make, a lot of the correct changes to have happen. I'm not forgiving them for the past by any means, but I'm willing to see where this progresses, where this goes. What are your thoughts on all of this then? Are you going to give it a chance, or is your Diablo time done for the foreseeable future? Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.